I don't, I'll speak for myself and I'd be interested in your take on it. I'm not saying that I don't believe that the resurrection happened. Um, what I am saying is it honestly wouldn't uh, be catastrophic to my faith if I found out that it didn't.
Right. If we somehow found Jesus' body, as they've reputedly done, you know,
Right. Every 10 years, some new documentary comes out. We got the
right.
bones. We got the
We
bones.
we finally found it. Yeah, and I am also not saying that the resurrection didn't happen. But what I am saying is that for me, and I struggled with this for years in seminary, the concept that Christians would somehow celebrate something other than the resurrection, right? That
Right.
something other than the resurrection would form the center of our life was a very challenging concept for me,
Mhm.
um, until you know death touched my life in sufficient ways for me to really understand the depth of its hold on us, right? And so I kept coming back to that same quote that Christopher just pulled out, right? That Paul says we preach Christ crucified, and it's like, and I found myself consistently being drawn to preach about the resurrection instead,
Mhm.
right? In sort of the first years of my ministry, but now sort of being more acquainted with death as a friend almost, right?
Right.
It's really the death of God on the cross, um, which which forms more of a center part of my faith. And so yeah, I'm there with you.
Well, I mean, think even, and we've talked about this, and I may have written about this, and I've definitely preached about this, that it's so funny to me that we talk about, and the church will talk about the resurrection being kind of the central piece, right? But what is our primary ritual action as a people on Sunday morning is the Eucharist, communion, Mass, Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it, which is where we are literally recalling and remembering, and in some ways, in various sacramental theologies, reconstituting the broken and dead body of Jesus, right? Um, if the
Yeah.
resurrection really was our central kind of at the core of the being of the church, wouldn't it make more sense if our primary ritual action was somehow a recreation of the resurrection, right? Um, I just think it's telling to me that the story that we tell over and over and over again ritually on Sundays is about his death,
Is the broken body.
is the brokenness of it, right?
Yeah.
Offered up to be consumed and masticated and ground up again in our teeth, right? Um, it's not the, the pomposity of resurrection that we celebrate once a year on Easter Day, right?
Well, and how I've started talking about this in Christian formation classes to sort of ease people into a theology like this is that the death of Christ on the cross is consistent with the humility and the humiliation of God throughout the Old Testament, right? I mean, and there are moments when we experience God as the tyrant, right,
Right.
and as the all powerful one, and those sort of really old and familiar ways of sort of talking about God's power. But even to the very beginning, when you think about um, the second creation story with Adam and Eve, the very first thing that the Lord does before throwing them out of the garden is he makes them clothes. He
Mm-hmm.
becomes, like a seamstress mother
Right.
to these children that have, trespassed in such a way. Um, and I think that we consistently see God on the side of the humble throughout our biblical record. Where in the Daily Office lectionary, we're working through the story of Exodus right now. Um, and yes, God does declare his power over and over again in that story through, controlling the weather or controlling different forms of life or turning the Nile into blood. But God also does all of this on behalf of this sort of underdog, right? Israel is nobody
right
at this point in the story, right? Like they're this group of people without a home, right? And yet they find themselves at the center of this God that is consistently on their side.
Yeah, the scandal of particularity, right, of God choosing a people. The scandal is not necessarily that God chose a people, but the kind of people God chose.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's prefigured even before Israel as a people, right? God consistently favors the younger son, right? It's at least in our biblical record, and I mean no offense to our Muslim brothers and sisters, but sure. Isaac is favored over Ishmael, who was a legitimate older son. Right. Jacob is favored over Esau. Right. And then Joseph is favored over all 11 of his older brothers, even the good ones.
Right.
And David is the youngest son of Jesse, and so it's just sort of like God is consistently on the side of the one that we don't expect, right? The weaker one, and it's the voice of the prophets sort of throughout history that are calling people to remember that the Lord is perpetually on the side of the poor, of the widow, of the orphan, of the blind, of the lame, of the sick. And
well, even in another prophet, right, in Hosea, is the metaphor of Israel being the prostitute, right, that has been wed to God, who constantly goes out, right, and finds someone else to be with, but the husband is always like, let's work it out, let's make it work.
Right. God is a cuckold in that story. Right. Like how humiliating is that?
And chooses to be, right? It's not like it's the weight of that story for me is not that God is surprised by Israel's unfaithfulness, but that God is like, oh yeah, I see it. And that's where we get that beautiful passage, you are no longer called friend or stranger, but spouse, right? That there's the deepening of the connection alongside of Israel, and then by extension humanity's unfaithfulness, and God's like, yeah, I'm right there.
Right. And I think we can see that. So I think we have that, and then we sort of get to Jesus' time when the temple there's this new sort of fervor around the second temple, and Israel loses themselves again. They begin to lose sight of the poor and the weak and the humble, right? And they begin to get caught up in the trappings of religion, despite the warnings of the prophets, and enter Jesus, right? And says, blows everything up and says, it's not about this religion at all. It's really about the people.